Good afternoon, and it's always a challenge to do a session right after lunch, but I hope we will have a very stimulating and energizing discussion and keep the interest levels high in the group. Just by way of introduction, I'm Suvojoy Sengupta. I'm a partner with McKinsey and Company based in Delhi. And I do a lot of my work, I'm not with a think tank, but I do a lot of my work in the area of public policy and public sector with our clients in the government in India, both at the central level as well as at state level. And we have a very distinguished panel here, and the focus of this discussion is the book that you probably would have seen and talked about earlier in the day, The Fifth Estate, the think tanks, public policy and governance. The author, Jim McGann, on our left, and he will talk about some of the key findings of the book and relevance to India. Then we have Manjeet Kriplani from Gateway House, Executive Director, Gateway House, and Harsha Singh, Executive Director of Brookings, India. So a distinguished panel, and we'll get started right away on the discussion. So, I did have a chance to read through comprehensively the book, and I think it is, it is fascinating. I think in terms of we interact with many of these institutions, broadly or loosely termed as think tanks, in our professional lives. And what this has tried to do is, the book gives a very good definition of what a think tank is and isn't, because there's a very wide range of different institutions and organizations who play a variety of roles, different types of think tanks, the role of the think tanks, and around public policy research, engagement, and connectivity. Some of the words, some of the terms that have been used to broadly describe what think tanks do. But to me, what came out was this linking of different stakeholders and constituencies, whether it's policymakers, academics, and the broader public. So almost demystifying the language, the jargon, the thinking of one or two of those constituencies for the rest. And that's kind of how Jim has defined the role of think tanks. So the role of the think tanks in creating connectivity, translating from one to the other, that I found was very interesting. I think another interesting concept that the book talks about is this concept of a revolving door, and I'm sure Jim will talk about that. And this is more from the US context, where there's a constant and a healthy stream of movement of professionals from the policy sphere into the think tank sphere, from government into think tanks, and the other way. And what Jim has shown in the book is how that can be a change, force for positive change, and cross-fertilization of ideas, and making sure policymakers are benefiting from the depth of research, and researchers are understanding how policy is formulated. Right? So be interesting way we can delve into that a little bit. The other interesting takeaway I had was the importance of India, because there is a list of countries and the number of think tanks, and Jim mentioned that that number might be updated, but US is clearly number one with about 1,800 odd think tanks. China is second, around 435. UK is third with 288, and India is fourth with 280. So we have quite a large number of think tanks in India. And if you heard the previous panel, there's a lot of people who are not think tanks, but through Twitter and other things, the number of opinions here is quite large. So one of the thoughts I had for the panel to discuss it is, building on what Jim will share in terms of the broad outline of his findings in the book, the role and relevance of think tanks in the Indian context, right? So the quantity versus quality, and the influence on policy of these think tanks. How should we be thinking about it? What are the observations of the panel in that respect, right? And the last element of the book, which I found interesting, was that he has mentioned a number of forward-looking trends which are shaping and will continue to shape the role and the relevance of think tanks. And there's about 14 different trends. Some of them we've discussed today around globalization, but 2 or 3 which I thought were very interesting. One was you mentioned the global hacktivist, anarchist, and populist movements, right? So how, in several examples, some of them like the anti-corruption movement in India 3 or 4 years ago. So the way public opinion is shaped and changes and where it draws information from is fundamentally being challenged and changed, right? The technology revolution and rate of change, and something you mentioned as policy tsunamis, which I thought was very interesting as well. And this need for governments to balance long-term versus the short-term, what we call short-termism. I think those 3 or 4, at least when I think of the Indian context, some of those are very relevant, and I would again urge the panel to think about how that applies from the Indian context. So the way we will do this, we will request Jim to share his thoughts, and given his experience in this area, probably allocate a little bit more time to Jim to share his thoughts on that. And then I will request my other panelists to share their thoughts, and then we will open up for questions and discussion. But some of the questions that I had, which we might want to deliberate as part of the panel: role and relevance of think tanks in the Indian context. Is there a way to think about quality versus quantity? And we as consultants, we love benchmarking, and I know that's not probably very directly relevant here. But how would we think about quality in terms of quality rigor as well as relevance and impact on policy, maybe as metrics to think about? What are some of the themes that of the 14 themes that Jim has mentioned in the book, which are relevant for the Indian context? And I really love this concept of the revolving door, and do we see that working in the Indian context? To some extent, yes. Can we benefit from that? So with that, I'll request Jim to share his thoughts.
A few important initial caveats. One, it was not my idea to talk about the book. It was Anu and Samir suggested it, and I agreed at their request to do it. Secondly, since it focuses on the U.S., I would, and since I, have spent a good deal of my time now traveling to 104 countries, I never, ever suggest that any country should model their think tanks after the U.S. What I do suggest that it is an interesting laboratory to sort of examine, and an active laboratory where, in terms of what is coming next, potentially innovations in terms of think tank design, not always in terms of the approaches that some think tanks take, the best model to follow, but it is an interesting and dynamic laboratory, and that is in part why I focus on it. There are elements that I think I would suggest countries might benefit from modeling after it, or at least exploring it, and I think the revolving door is one, and I think last night the minister provided an opening in that regard in terms of how do you introduce innovation within government, how do you transform government out of what is by the nature of government, and I think in contrast to think tanks, that there's not the status quo. Maintaining what is generally what, even in terms of budgetary, that there's incrementalism, that change occurs in an incremental fashion. I think that in many respects, and I'll talk about this, that the nature of both in the US and elsewhere, there are fundamental changes that have taken place, and that these are, I think, posing significant challenges to think tanks. I remain very bullish on think tanks and the role that they play. However, in the spirit of being provocative after lunch, would say that, and as a part of carrying on the theme from last night and this morning, that we all must realize that books, journals, and think tanks may be dead unless they innovate, and meaning that that institutions need to think, one, content will remain king, and quality will remain king, but the means by which, the medium by which we deliver the message, the research, is radically transformed. And I'll use the last election as an indication of how fundamentally this has been transformed. I would also suggest that, to continue to be provocative, that policymakers are no longer the sole or primary audience of think tanks, and that a realization of that and an appreciation of that is a new reality that think tanks must understand and internalize, so that the quality will remain important. It will remain the sort of central defining characteristic of think tanks, but how we deliver the content and what channels we deliver the content, and to what audiences we will deliver what we produce, is a universal, is a challenge that will define whether think tanks remain relevant, and in many respects whether institutions will continue to exist. And the comments from in the last session from the students, I think, are or the younger people, I don't know what term we should use that doesn't insult them or define us in a way that we don't want to be defined, is the fact that a realization that I had with one of my students who came. I was preparing for a midterm, and I was going through all the reading that was required for the midterm to help them prepare, and one of the students had the audacity to raise his hand and say, "Dr. McGann, can't you just tell us what we need to know? Why do we have to read these books?" And it was that realization that how things are delivered for students is totally different. They don't have televisions, they don't read newspapers, and their life is delivered endlessly in terms of information and news. In contrast, in the US, which defines it in terms of a certain generation, if you look at who advertises during the nightly news, the two principal advertisers are Viagra and Cialis, which sort of tells you the age bracket that is being targeted in terms of the news. And it is stunning. It is those realities that I think will define the nature of think tanks from the sort of how we organizationally and in terms of technology deliver the content that we produce. And those are new realities that must be explored. And I suggested in the last session, it is a challenge that I think that through training and in terms of sharing these strategies and engaging the next generation of think tank scholars and leaders will help us prepare for the future. The other dimension, which is connected to the policy tsunami, is the fact that think tanks, I think, and another, I think, provocative, hopefully, statement would be that the historical view of think tanks is that they, and the sweet spot for think tanks is the mid and long-term analysis. I think that is over. That the increased velocity of information and policy flows demand that think tanks respond at a much quicker pace and to events and issues in the moment. Not to become captured by that, but unless there is some sense and providing policymakers and the public what the hell is going on, because increasingly this concept that I have suggested in terms of policy tsunamis, we are already experiencing that there is a small blip that appears in one country in an area which people think is exceptional But the reality is that because of globalization, because of technology, can now rise and sweep across the globe, and those who do not, and think tanks that do not understand, or at least attempt to understand that phenomenon, will be buried by it, because policy makers and leaders will be buried by it. I think increasingly that policy at every level in every region will be much more unpredictable. We are now in an age, largely because of the policy tsunamis, largely because of the increased velocity of information and policy flows, where there will be increased instability. And multipolarity contributes to that in a different way. But these are new and important realities. I would not be depressed by these. These all present, which is the other important challenge for think tanks, opportunities. Each one of them presents an opportunity for think tanks if they innovate, if they transform, if they understand the dynamics. And this is not just in the US, not in Europe, but also, and most, I think, importantly, in India. Because the nature, the ability to respond to these and to essentially understand them, given the specific characteristics in India, enables, makes it possible for India to be better positioned than other countries in the region and in some respects around the globe. And that, I think, is an opportunity, and institutions have an opportunity if they understand, as was mentioned in the last session, of how do you not only come up with great ideas, come up with innovative analysis, but how do you curate that? How do you understand in terms of not just a single audience, but understanding what strategic communications is, and embracing that, and using that to extend the reach of your message. One important indication, and I would, in terms of Francois from IFRI mentioned in terms of Donald Trump, certainly not in terms of economics, but I think there were important signals in terms of the last election, one of which was picked up, and the importance of the young scholars who were in the room, the fact that information is now customized. The reality of Donald Trump is that he was able, which is the great, important threat that every think tank, wherever you are, must understand, is he cut out the middleman being the media, the middleman being think tanks and elites. Understanding that is important, because if you think it's a part of messy America and its politics, think again. People now understand that tapping into groups that have similar interests around social media, that you can mobilize that group by understanding that, marketing to it, and narrowcasting to them, and mobilize them in order to influence elections, will be the increasing phenomenon. And so it is connected to the reality that policymakers are no longer the principal audience, that you can go direct, and therefore that will be increasingly disruptive, and it is an important vacuum that think tanks must fill. I think I've said enough provocative stuff. I'll say one thing about revolving door. I think that while it is institutionalized, and part of the purpose of the book is really two dimensions. One is to document the revolving door in the US system, and the fact that it is deeply institutionalized. And the second is to demonstrate, which I don't think tanks do enough, is what is the value added? Why are think tanks important? And to communicate that. Think tanks are very good at communicating their institution and what they're doing. Also in terms of around specific policies, we're not so good as a community in communicating and articulating why we're important, what's the value added, and why the public should commit the financial resources to enable think tanks to grow and have a positive impact on society. And then finally, in terms of the revolving door, the interesting thing in the US context, which has now changed, is the fact that the revolving door historically was policymakers going into government and then going back either to the same think tank or to another think tank, which happens quite frequently. But now, and last month, the North America Think Tank Summit took place, and I put together all the bios for that meeting. 30 to 40% of those executives, scholars and executives that were a part of the meeting came from journalism. And so increasingly, there is cross-fertilization, and I would contend that the final trend which we need to understand is that historically the competition for think tanks was other think tanks. That is no longer the case. That there is bleeding in terms of organizational lines, in terms of journalists who think that they're think tankers, and that's an important dimension, and the reality of that is reflected in this 40% of the bios. People were either heads of bureaus or journalists who now have migrated, maybe because of the collapse of the media sector, into think tanks. And that's an important phenomenon. So.
Thank you very much. I think the comments you made around the overall the environment for think tanks changing, the end audience is changing is a very important one. That it's not just for policymakers, but given technology and given globalization, the end public and many other similar constituencies become very important and relevant as well. I'll hand over to the next panelist, Manjeet, and I think here would suggest let's focus on the Indian context and some of the concepts that Jim has talked about. How do you see that playing out, and what can we learn in India from this?
Thank you, and I will stay within my time. Jim, you've absolutely said it right. As a former journalist who moved into the think tank world, I can tell you this is a very good transition, because journalists know how to research, and the media is no longer affording journalism the space to do the in-depth research that used to be done. There's no money. Media houses have become driven by investors. They're now owned by companies. And so there isn't the same kind of labor of love that journalism used to be. And I think think tanks have a huge opportunity, especially in India, to step, and in the US, to step into that role, because we can do the research, and journalists are very good researchers, and they also know how to get good titles, which means you can grab the reader better than a think tank who would really come up with very nerdy and wooden titles. So, and that helps with social media as well. About the Indian think tank world, there are two things. Gateway House was started about 7 to 8 years ago, and at that time there was a slew of new think tanks that came out. The difference is in India that they were private think tanks that were set up. And there's been a movement, I think, with private think tanks. There were 7 or 8 private think tanks, including urban ones, small ones. And there were think tanks also of late with this government in the government sector. So you have Niti Aayog, which has become a think tank. The PMO has a think tank within itself. And state governments, and I know Maharashtra, Fadnavis, also, and Chandrababu Naidu also have internal think tanks in which to incubate ideas. And that's what a think tank is supposed to do. We are supposed to be the incubator of ideas, because India needs ideas in order to have a future. And if, as Richard Haas told me when I left CFR, that if really the country that can successfully replicate the old US think tank models is India, then really we have a great opportunity lying ahead for us. What we need that the US has is the participation of the private sector. So we have all the private think tanks that have come up have really struggled, the Indian think tanks, because for some reason Indian business and Indian private philanthropy does not see it as having an expertise to do any policy making. They're also afraid to step on the government's toes. when government is in fact starting to outsource some of their thinking to the private sector, to private think tanks, the corporate sector is not keeping up with that. Instead of which they are giving money to foreign think tanks that have set up in India, sorry, with due respect, primarily because they do see them as a brand that's already established and also as a way to lobby out of Washington. This is particularly the case with the US and not so much with anywhere else in the world where India does not have that deep a business interest. So we need to get our corporate sector to start investing in us and in PhDs and universities, creating chairs, centers. There is a whole world of think tanks to be explored in India. We have no IT think tank, we have only a Chamber of Commerce. We have no business think tanks, we have only chambers of commerce. We have no economic think tanks, but that are not funded by government. And even the government-funded think tanks really could do with an infusion of some private money because it brings a more pragmatic aspect of policy into the thinking. Do I have a minute more or am I done? Done. So that's one thing 2 more minutes, okay. We need, and we also need the private sector to move away from this old, tried, and really very tired habit of lobbying. They need to understand that research-based, evidence-based research is really a much better pitch for a change in policy than simply lobbying. And this is the right time with this government to make that transition. We're in a peculiar situation now in India because when we started Gateway House, it was because we saw business leading India's diplomacy. And now it's exact opposite. The government is leading India's diplomacy and the business sector is having a very hard time catching up. So there are some things to think about, and thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is very clear, the message that private sector needs to step up in, not just for funding, but being an active participant in shaping the ideas and active input into policy rather than lobbying. I'll turn to Harsha to share his thoughts.
Thank you. Jim, I want to congratulate you for such a detailed and thoughtful and thought-provoking work. It was very insightful in another way for somebody who wants to learn some of the important events, both in terms of economic issues as well as foreign policy issues that were addressed in the US and what role think tanks played. Since I'm looking at Indian think tanks, so I just want to first point out some of the differences, and that depends on what is the starting point. Like in economics of technology, the starting point often determines the trajectory. And the starting point in India was that the government of India established think tanks because like in any development model, you try and see what are the large gaps, and the private sector doesn't feel very capable of filling it in. That's why there was a Meiji Restoration in Japan, when the government stepped in and just offered the industry on the plate to the private sector. So that began. Then there was partial government support or as far as, because you've talked about a whole range of think tanks. I want to focus mainly on policy related think tanks, because otherwise the discussion will become very diffuse. So it was only later that industry started taking an interest in this. And the interesting point is that first there was so-called Indian think tanks, and I'm just looking at my previous speaker because she looked at me when she talked about think tanks linked to US. So I want to clarify that those which have come recently, like Carnegie, Brookings, India, so these are linked to US only in terms of the model of scholarship, not in terms of trying to push an ideology or to push a point of view, and definitely not to try and do so through lobbying. Because any government, when you are in the policy think tank situation, any government has the prerogative to choose what it wants to follow. If a think tank does not have credibility, then that think tank is wholly unlikely to succeed in the Indian context. And this is a government which actually is taking feedback and knowledge not only from think tanks in the Indian context, but from all kinds of sources, foreign, domestic, etc. And in some areas, it's way ahead of the think tank community. The kind of initiatives it's taking in digital, for instance, the kind of initiatives which are being taken on education innovation, etc. So you are not in a situation where there is a government which is waiting to be lobbied, etc. That's completely false. It cannot work. And if any think tank follows that route, that's the death knell of that think tank, because you have to build expertise. Otherwise, the policymaker doesn't take interest in it. So once you have the trajectory and starting point, the kind of experiences you've defined in the, or described in the book become very different for the kind of experiences which India has. Then, to me, if I'm in the policy work, the primary audience, not the sole audience, because the distinction is sole and primary. The primary audience in India is the policymaker. However, what we have learned over time, including through developing the process of regulation in the country, is that information, diversity of views, options enrich your perspective and also provide a wider basis for discussion and inclusive debate, which is important in the policy framework. But what you come up with is not with an eye on these other stakeholders. If you are a policy think tank, you have to see what is relevant for the country and then try and see what that implies in terms of changes in the system, or whether what the government is doing at a point of time actually can be improved in a very quick way. That's why low-hanging fruit is very important. I'll give you an example. For example, the definition of rural electrification. You know, which village is electrified? If an initial definition was one household gets electrified, the village is electrified. Then a think tank, and I'm giving you a real example, and I can give you many of this from my own think tank's experience. Think tank says, no, that can't be adequate. You need to have a higher threshold for that. It may be 10, it may be 50. And actually, if it makes sense, the government is good enough to change the definition. So still, the primary audience is the government. The other thing is that Indian think tanks are relatively small. You have written a lot about Brookings here, and you quote a number which is a few hundred persons there. But we here, you know, both of us on this table, have just a handful of people. And that imposes certain kind of limitations on what you can do and how much scope you have to, for example, look in that long list which you mentioned, what is important, and start working on that. Second, the US think tanks, outreach, the focus, if it is not on India, then you will never build up the kind of credibility which you need. Then on revolving door, it has begun in a small little way, very small, but it's completely different in India. It's not a revolving door. The door opens one way. So maybe over time, it will become revolving when the discussion becomes far more engaged. So what Indian think tanks have to focus on is to build scholarship and capacity, to build capabilities to improve communications. And there's a paradigm change on that, as we saw in the previous discussion. Then you have to take a look at, you know, there is a supply chain in trade or in production, a conceptual chain of knowledge building Where do you pitch? Where are you able to actually impact upon? Is it in holding events? Is it in some kind of database, as you talked about evaluation? Is it in terms of looking at the work of others and synthesizing? Those are the kind of questions a think tank with very limited membership has to consider. Then you talk about 4 different aspects: competitive, resource, policy, and technology. To me, other than technology, all the other 3 depend on the quality of your work. And if you don't have high quality of work with credibility, you will not be competitive. And if you start looking at the other think tank and starting to see, hey, they are doing this, I must do this, that's completely the wrong way to go in my view. So I'm giving you my personal opinion now. You have to work on whatever strengths or issues which you develop in your mind. So once I look at these kind of things, I was looking at the long list you have provided, and I know this is in your mind, but I didn't find a mention of jobs there. And you take any environment, be it India or US, jobs and the future of jobs is prime. So the point I want to make is that India, the trajectory was very different. Therefore, the implication for the work of think tanks and the engagement of the policymaker itself was very different. Second, in that environment, the newcomers have to strive even harder. And in order to do that, if they don't do so with quality of work and credibility, they are not going to succeed.
Thank you very much. I think we'll take some questions. Probably I'll just, based on the last 2 speakers, there was this point about lobbying, and I think in some cases in your book you mentioned advocacy-based think tanks, etc. And I think there is probably some perception in India that that think tanks play more of a lobbying kind of role, and especially with some of the foreign-funded ones, right? So, and probably no truth to that, but in your research, whether this is something that is it just in India, or is it if you come across this concern or perception in other countries, and what should think tanks do in order to address that? And probably the quality of scholarship, objectivity, those are really the measures by which one can address that. But I think that I picked up from both the last speakers on that. Let's take a few round of questions and then ask the panel to respond. Yes, sir.
My name is Ishant Bari. Now, my question is for Harsha. So you mentioned government think tanks as well as private think tanks. Now, government think tanks, we have seen this government is very, very proactive in terms of its diplomacy and its the way it adapts its foreign policy, number 1. Number 2, the reincarnation of the planning commission as Davos, and Prime Minister has branded it as a government think tank, where private individuals are involved in day-to-day policy making. So is that a good step on a way forward, or would it, at the end of the day, execute the same kind of projects that the planning commission was executing for so many years?
Thanks. Second, I'll come to you now.
My name is Rajiv Bhatia. I would like to make a comment on the basis of my experience for 3 years as Director General of the Indian Council of World Affairs and 2 years of work with Gateway House. And then I'll also ask a question, Mr. Chairman. Our experience is that Indian think tank scene has completely transformed itself in the past 5 to 10 years. It has proliferated in terms of width and quality and depth, impact, and that the government has become far more receptive to Indian think tanks than it ever was in the past. We must ask a question: who is actually staffing the think tank today in India? Clearly, there are 4 categories. Number 1, I think a majority are scholars, which is a very good thing. They are coming from universities, etc. Then there are journalists, small number, but it is growing. A very big segment, thirdly, is the former government professionals, diplomats, civil servants, defense personnel. And fourthly, very, very tiny number of politicians. It's not there. We can also ask, sir, a question which is, what really we regard as our audience today? I think there are 4 or 5 categories which can be mentioned there. First is government. As I mentioned, they become much more receptive. But the problem is that when government takes your ideas, it doesn't acknowledge. It passes it off as its own, and we have to be ready, because that is how the life is. Citizenry, that is undoubtedly a major target for us. Thirdly, fellow think tanks in India itself, and also fellow think tanks abroad. So that is there as well. To a very limited extent, political class. You heard the minister saying yesterday that yes, we read, maybe some of them they do, but then they have other channels to get our ideas. My question, Mr. Chairman, is this, and I'm putting it to Jim actually. With his vast knowledge and experience now, how does he look at Indian think tanks in comparison to other think tanks in Asia? Thank you.
Thank you. Ma'am.
The topic given was the fifth estate. So it's an open question to the panel. I would like to understand what are the parameters of fifth estate, and have the think tanks qualified to that level? Because fourth estate I do understand is the media. The fifth estate, what are the parameters to define it as such?
Okay. Maybe one last question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Sambandhan from the Hindu Center for Politics and Public Policy. I was just wondering, just thinking aloud perhaps, and also, are we overstating our own presence as think tanks and policy research institutions in effectively transforming government policy when the final call really is taken by the political class? And a political class in a democracy, which we all function in, takes its decision based on what it conceives as the popular will. Take for instance demonetization. It is said that it came from a think tank, but I'm sure we were all taken by surprise by that. So is it to suit the political class that a decision should be taken? Because John Maynard Keynes famously said that ideas would overpower vested interests. The key question is India as a political society there yet, where ideas dominate vested interests? I would like to submit no. And a colleague asked about, pointed about Niti Aayog and Planning Commission. I would like to submit that Government of India bodies have always been think tanks, including part of ministries. The Planning Commission could be conceived as a think tank in the first place. They had no constitutional authority, A. It had executive authority, B. But it did come up with tons and tons and tons of working papers that towards the end of the Manmohan Singh government, they put it up on the website. Please send us your address, we'll mail it to you, we'll post it to you. So governments have always been in the business of think tanks, and I think liking us to believe that Niti Aayog is a newly created think tank is something we should be wary about. Of course, the executive powers of Niti Aayog may have been diluted, but by its very conceptual nature, the Planning Commission was a think tank for the socialist mode of economic development at that particular point in time. That's about all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, I'd now request the panel to respond to some of these. Maybe start with you, Jim.
To quickly go through the questions, and from my perspective, in terms of coming from the research that I've done and my examination of think tanks in India, that one clear thing is that they are under-resourced, both financially and in terms of human resources, and in many respects part of the challenge, and this was reflected in comments from think tanks in the visits that I made and discussions we had, is that they are underappreciated, both by policymakers and the public. Clearly, both in India and in many countries, the reality is that government as the principal source of funding for think tanks will diminish over time. And it is, as economies grow, it is essential, part of the, I think, the charge or need within India and elsewhere is to get the private sector to understand that it is in their interest, even if it's narrow, in terms of educating, in terms of workforce issues and education, that they should support think tanks on both micro, macro, and specific policy areas, that it's in their business interest to do that, and therefore they should support these institutions. And that it is not, as things change, the sole role of government, and that the only way to support institutions that do public policy is by public support. The reality is that that's not going to be the case in the future, and that it's essential that in education, and I think it's an engagement process, where you're engaging in partnership with the private sector, both that it's in its interest and it's in the public good to participate. In terms of lobbying, the case I would use to illustrate this in terms of being careful of being defined as lobbying organizations is Belgium, where in terms of in anticipation of expansion of think tanks moving to Brussels, and an irony of great proportion is that the think tanks in Belgium did not effectively alter the wording and language in legislation that made think tanks synonymous with lobbying organizations, which had a great deleterious effect on how the institutions are defined. So I would be careful about and making sure and guarding, certainly within India, that you're not defined in that way, because it may have a negative view, and at some point legislation, and the legislation in Belgium was to control and define and to provide specific regulations which are inappropriate for nonprofit, non-governmental organizations. The fifth estate part is that one was the king's first estate, second clergy, third estate was labor, fourth estate, which is really the only contemporary formulation of it, is the media, and I intentionally defined it as the fifth estate to assert that these institutions play an important role, certainly in the US context. The centrality and role of think tanks play, I think, can be best illustrated by one example. And that is, if you look at the 9/11 Commission, if there was ever an issue, policy issue that faced the United States, the composition of that commission is almost entirely composed of think tank executives. And so it is different in terms of the perception of experts, but in the US, the value of independence and experts was to go not to civil servants, not to create a commission, but to go outside to think tanks and rely on them. And it is that which I think underscores the importance and centrality of think tanks in the US context. The final point, I think, is that it really is incumbent, whether it's the private sector or emphasizing the value-added or expert dimension of think tanks, is that the think tanks in this room need to make that case. If there's to be a change in India in terms of the support and perception of think tanks that are under-resourced and underappreciated, it is incumbent upon the institutions in this room to make that case, and in some respects the collective voice of this group can help make that happen and serve as a catalyst for change.
Thank you. Manjeet, any responses to the questions as well as any overall final thoughts?
And Jim has pretty much said what I wanted to. The good news, Jim, is that 7 years later, fewer people ask me if I work for a fish tank. And also also about the lobbying issue. Actually, you have not mentioned the big scandals that took place in the US last year, which was covered by the New York Times, about think tanks in the US taking money from foreign governments to do their work that is in the foreign interest. So maybe at some other point we can discuss it.
I can address that because that was, if you look at it closely, which I did, the New York Times authors who wrote that story were associated, and one was fired from the Harvard University and the Boston Globe because she was tied to a PAC that was supporting not Hillary Clinton, but Elizabeth Warren potentially, and Bernie Sanders. So when that story appeared, it was the first salvo in the 2016 presidential election, and showed, unfortunately, that the New York Times has succumbed to the commercial interest that you identified, because they were more interested in selling papers in a sensational way. And I essentially raised to the ombudsman and the editor that if you're looking at institutions in terms of conflict of interest, you might want to look at your journalists who are conflicted up the wazoo. If only to fully disclose that. She did not disclose both of their conflict of interest that they had and were apparent, and the reason why she was fired from both Harvard and Boston Globe.
Harsha, any closing thoughts or responses to the questions?
That's not to suggest that there isn't a need for greater transparency and oversight in terms of think tanks.
Just to close the loop on what Jim has explained, there is now an out-of-court settlement which these people are paying to Brookings, because you were referring to something which involved Brookings. So it has been shown that there was not really a basis for this, and there's an out of. So that has been settled in a way which was not anticipated by the writers when they wrote it. And now I want to just address some of the questions, plus the comment you made when you were introducing the second session, which is these foreign think tanks, the foreign funded ones. Somehow an automatic assumption is that if there is a link to a think tank with something outside, say Brookings India or Carnegie, it's funded by outside. Factually, at least for Brookings India, I can tell you that's completely not the case. It not only has Indian management, etc., but only Indian funding. In fact, we don't have FCRA. So even if somebody outside wants to fund us, we can't accept it. So our focus is completely Indian. Second, there are various models of funding. I don't want to go into detail, but and one might be better than the other, so I'm not commenting on that. But what Brookings India did is that it basically went with a large number of people with very small amounts, a relatively small amount. And in that context, what it does is that it provides us with flexibility to choose whatever we are trying to choose on. And as I said, I'm not trying to comment on the desirability of any model. I'm only describing a factual historical fact. Now on Niti Aayog, whether it's a good step or not, in addition to the comments which you made, and I completely agree with you. In fact, that was my starting point. I think it's going to do good, and Niti Aayog has shown that it can, because of the links it has with so many different thinkers on various issues, that they can very much think out of the box, the way the box was defined earlier. What impact it has, one has to see. But in terms of a number of solutions which it has come out with, they were not along expected lines. So I think it's always good to have different perspectives and efforts. On staffing, I don't want to go in detail. What you said is absolutely the kind of distribution with very, very few politicians there. I would say that a lot of journalists are better scholars than several scholars. So, I completely agree with the point of view you expressed earlier. So it's a question of how you approach an issue. Whether you have some kind of innovativeness which produces a new way of thinking or highlights a chink in the armor which needs to be addressed, or even a different model. Also, on who is the audience, you're completely right that the government doesn't normally acknowledge. But then if you are working in the policy space, if the government is even engaging with you or taking up certain ideas, that itself is a result which is desirable, because that shows that a government thinks that your work actually is credible, because you are not the only option the government has. So I think acknowledgement is something which would be required for someone who wants to be known on the wider horizon, but impact is something which is very important. And there, the entity which is choosing is the entity which decides what to choose. So it's a competition amongst ideas also. It's not only competition amongst think tanks. I don't think there is very much competition as such among think tanks, because there's a lot of work around. Second, you engage in different ways, directly, which is what we have been talking about, and indirectly. For example, I'm thinking of building an information base, a database on success cases in whichever area you take it. If that database is there, the policymaker can look at it, the industry can look at it, the researcher can look at it, NGOs can look at it, depending on what the issue is. So a think tank, by just developing a database widely available to everyone, enriches the knowledge system in which even the policymaker is operating. How does Jim so anyway, what are the, no, because I just took how does Jim look, this was the question at the end. What are the parameters to define the fifth estate? This was an issue. I think Jim has described this in his book in the sense of, I pointed out that journalists sometimes are more scholarly than the scholars. Jim's book actually distinguishes between good scholars and good journalists. So in that comparison, I think the scholars are more deep in the analysis than journalists, because they have to write for an audience where depth can only confuse, rather than, so they have to understand it in depth, but produce the concept in a more simple way. So I think in that context, it's work in progress in India as a fifth estate. Your system is far more developed than ours, but we are in a world where time gets very quickly compressed. So hopefully we'll be there earlier than you were in your trajectory.
Okay. Thank you very much, Harsha. I think we've overshot our time a little bit. I want to thank my panelists, Jim, Manjeet, and Harsha, for your thoughts, and thank you to the audience.